we are currently in the era of open source models that are very good performing, at 7 and 13 billion parameters. Many of those are not commercially licensable. The next iteration, the next generation of these models will be, and then you're going to see a trend that is already happening dramatically accelerate, and that is language model prompting in every piece of software that you use.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're listening. Welcome back to AI and the Future of Work. Thanks again for making this one of the most downloaded podcasts about the future of work. If you enjoy what we do, please like, comment, and share in your favorite podcast app. And we'll keep sharing amazing conversations like the one we have for today. I'm your host, Dan Turchin, CEO of PeopleRain, the AI platform for IT and HR employee service. I'm also an investor and an advisor to more than 30 AI-first companies and a firm believer in the power of technology to make humans better. If you're passionate about changing the world with AI, or maybe just looking for your next adventure, let's talk. Now, we learn from AI thought leaders weekly on this show, and the added bonus is you get one AI fun fact each week. Today's fun fact: Tiernan Ray, repeat guest on this podcast and one of the best journalists in the business, writes this week in ZDNet that autonomous machines aren't creative, even though they may produce human-like output. Tiernan cites Ziv Epstein from MIT, who was quoted in an article in Science magazine that the very term artificial intelligence might misleadingly imply that these systems exhibit human-like intent, agency, or even self-awareness. There's always one or more human creators behind every work generated by LLMs. Let's stop imputing intent to statistical models trained on next word or next pixel prediction. As always, we'll link to the full article in today's show notes. Now, shifting to this week's conversation, Christopher Penn writes one of the few newsletters I read weekly. I have no idea how I ended up on his mailing list, but I'll never opt out. Despite the bright rainbow unsubscribe here buttons he prominently displays, I thought I was there to learn about Google Analytics, but you know what? I stick around week after week as Christopher provides well-researched, thought-provoking commentary on all topics related to generative AI. I wanted you to meet Christopher because recent guests like Pradeep, Menon, and Ken Wenger, like them, Christopher doesn't settle for soundbite-level commentary, and he is fond of sharing unpopular opinions, always backing them up with data. Christopher's the co-founder and chief data scientist at TrustInsights.ai. He's a 6-time IBM Champion in IBM Data and AI, a Brand 24 Top 100 digital marketer, an Onalytica Top 100 AI and marketing influencer, and co-host of the award-winning Marketing Over Coffee marketing podcast. He's also the author of 24 marketing books. Christopher's list of accolades and accomplishments goes on for days. But for now, without further ado, Christopher, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the podcast. Let's get started by having you share a bit more about your background and how you get into this space.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me on the show. I come to all of this from an IT background. Actually, my formal credentials were in IT. And in the early 2000s, I worked at a financial services startup. And what happened was that IT became marketing technology. Update the web server became update the website. Manage the send mail instance became send the email newsletter. And then in the 2010s, I really started digging into analytics. And as part of that, in 2013, I really started learning and developing my skills in the R programming language, which, we can have philosophical debates about R versus Python. But that was the beginning of my journey within the artificial intelligence space, the machine learning specifically. And then in 2019, I think it was 2019, everyone started playing with large language models, right? Because in 2017, the paper came out, the seminal paper, Attention is All You Need, on the transformer architecture, which has been a revolution that people didn't really understand what these tools were capable of until you started seeing, language models doing things with emergent capabilities that you wouldn't think they could do just with predicting the next, word or token. And then, of course, last year, November 2022, OpenAI threw ChatGPT out to the world, and suddenly a whole bunch of people who don't understand the mechanics and don't need to can now use generative AI. And of course, it's been it's been sort of the 10-year overnight success, if you will.
Christopher, you're kind of the Google Analytics guru, and you're talking to a lot of marketers who maybe want to start their journey toward data-driven marketing nirvana. What's your coaching for those who are just getting started on that journey?
The number one question I have for everyone is, are you okay with bad news? Right. And it sounds so flippant and so trite, but it is 100% true. Becoming data-driven means you have to accept that sometimes, perhaps more than sometimes, the data is going to tell you things you don't want to hear, right? Like, hey, this program sucks, or that pet project that you love is performing, or that channel that you love creating content for just doesn't deliver any results. And then are you willing to make decisions that go against what you think is your instincts or your gut or your experience when the data clearly says you're going the wrong way? It's kind of like that. The difference between someone who is willing to use a map app on their phone to get directions versus that person, and it's almost always a guy who's like, oh, no, I know a shortcut. And, like 28 minutes later on a 10-minute drive, you're like, what the heck happened? He's like, oh, a shortcut. Like, no, that you didn't listen to the data that was in front of you. You instead went with opinion. And there is a place for opinion and subjectivity and gut and all that stuff, the intangibles. But if you are saying you are data driven, you have to have that mindset of, I will listen to the data and then I will make decisions based on the data, with the data as the first decision factor. And if you're not comfortable with those things, then analytics may not be as helpful to you as you would think. A lot of people, particularly folks who are a little less progressive in their thinking, tend to use analytics to just justify what the decisions they've already made, and they will use data when it suits them and not when it doesn't. There's a very famous quote from Ted Sarandos of Netflix saying, like, 70% of our decision-making process is gut, and we just use data to back up the decisions we've already made. Like, that's not how analytics works, but okay. So that would be my advice, is be comfortable with bad news, and then be willing to take actions even when you disagree with them if the data clearly says you're going the wrong way.
Christopher, I've been following your exploration of generative AI via musings in your newsletter and your frequent video posts. What has surprised you most so far?
What has surprised me most are emergent properties. You would not, when we look at the architecture of these models and things, they're basically just big libraries of probabilities. Like, there's not even words in these models. There's no words at all. It's just probabilities, the weights, the model weights, and the parameters around these models. And for those who are unfamiliar with large language models, think of a language model. Here's how I explain how language models are created. One, you go out and you eat a whole bunch of pizza, right? And you take notes. And then from all those pizzas you ate, assuming you're not dead from overconsumption, you write a recipe book of what you think pizza is, right? And you've had Chicago deep dish, you've had New York, you've had all the variations, and you write this recipe book. And then when it comes time, now you start to make pizzas based on the recipe, the notes that you took from eating all of those pizzas. The recipe book is the model, right? It's the large language model, like the GPT-4 model that powers OpenAI's ChatGPT. There is no pizza in a book, right? There's made pictures of pizza. There's notes about how to make pizza, but there is no actual pizza in the book. And as a result, when you go and have the model make new pizzas, it's drawing on its experiences and its recipe book. But there's no, you're never going to find the exact pizza that went into your experiences of making this pizza recipe book. What has surprised me is what's called emergent properties, where things, because of the complexity of the architecture and how it interlinks, it gives rise to capabilities that these things should not on paper be able to do. Like we're starting to see with the larger models, the ability to do reasoning, right? We're solving problems, feeding these things, medical doctor exams and stuff that should be theoretically outside the capability of a next word prediction model. But because of the complexity of how language works, these tools have these capabilities, and they really should not. And to me, that's surprising, because it makes you wonder, as models do get larger and more complex, what additional emergent properties will show up. Now, in no way, shape, or form are we talking about artificial general intelligence, Skynet and self-aware machines. The even with today's compute power, that is far away, because the compute power just required to build a model like that is going to require a paradigm change in computation itself. And we'll get there, because quantum computing has those theoretical capabilities, but we're not there yet. I mean, quantum computers aren't even stable yet. But even in the next iteration of OpenAI's GPT-5, Google Palm 4 or whatever, or the next edition of Facebook's Meta's Llama model, we're going to see more and more emergent properties. And that's going to be something really interesting to see, how these tools behave, what they're capable of that we don't think they're capable of, and the many different ways that people are going to use them.
The week when Sam Altman and other tech leaders were on Capitol Hill talking about AI governance and forthcoming regulation, you provided some very insightful commentary in your newsletter that, for me, was, I mentioned at the front, it goes way beyond how to use Google Analytics. I'd be curious to get your perspective on the letter to pause. If you did or didn't sign it, and just your perspective on, was it a good thing, and did you consider signing it if you didn't?
It was dumb. And I realize it's probably not the most popular opinion. The same as I don't think that the current hand-wringing in the press is any more intelligent. It's really stupid. People worrying about AI being an existential threat to humanity. We have an existential threat to humanity. It's called climate change, but no one wants to talk about that, because that would require doing actual things to change your behavior. The same is true of AI. A lot of these big, bold sci-fi claims distract from the very real problems that AI poses today. For example, model bias. In OpenAI's own documentation, which Sam Altman is the CEO of the company, it says, hey, we know there's bias in these models. For example, we provide more positive sentiment about European American names than African American names, and we consistently see negative sentiment around the names of Black women. Like, that's a problem that you need to solve today. Forget about whether AI is going to take everyone's jobs. If you're going to roll out a GPT-4 model, say, in hiring, right, and you're scanning resume names, and the tools starts to identify the ethnicity of names, you now have a problem, because if you're using a model like this, it's going to start having more negative sentiment around Letitia's resume than Linda's resume, and that is a problem. And it's a problem that the large language model makers, by and large, have given lip service to solving, but have not applied any publicly disclosed, transparent efforts as to how they're going to address this. Now, OpenAI and other big model makers seem to be taking the approach of doing very primitive word filtration on the results, that the models deliver. And that is, I think, intercepting the most problematic use cases, with also unexpected and kind of silly side results, side consequences. Instead of saying, the core fundamental problem is you ingested a whole bunch of text from the internet. The internet represents all of humanity, and not all of humanity is good. You would be better served not ingesting, say, the massive archives of hate speech from certain Reddit forums, not putting that in the model in the first place, and then you don't have to try and figure out how you're going to take it out. Now, there are some academic projects. Ulithra AI is looking at one right now called it's called LEASE, and essentially what they're trying to do is have a model be able to forget a concept, right? To blank forget a concept. But the challenge with doing that is that, because these are fundamentally just word predictions, if you dampen or delete chunks of words from this large library of probabilities, you're going to delete other words around them or change their weights in ways that are unpredictable and maybe negative. Example, if I'm Korean, if I say I'm going to remove all the racial slurs about Koreans from this model, I may also end up erasing chunks of Korean culture because it's inherently tied to my identity. So I would be better served saying, let's maybe go through the training data to begin with and remove the egregious examples of racism against Koreans. That would solve that problem. So yeah, I think the pause letter and the legislative recommendations and things, yes, those are theoretical issues that should be addressed at some point, but the very real problems today are not being addressed because we're spending so much time worrying about Skynet and not whether you're going to get a job or not because an AI system said your name is the wrong name to have.
Going back 300 years to the first industrial revolution, pausing innovation has never worked. Innovating responsibly, however, always has worked. Those are great examples that you give. I will say, though, Christopher, I would not like to be the one responsible for determining what is and isn't hate speech. And I believe every word you're saying. That's very consistent with my opinion, but it is a hard line to walk. And the old argument related to porn, I'll know it when I see it, is we've reached the useful limits of that as an argument when it comes to what should and shouldn't go into an LLM.
And it also is going to vary by region. For example, in Germany and in good chunks of the EU, but especially in Germany, you're prohibited by law to reference in any way other than basic journalistic ways the Nazis, right? You may not promote Nazism of any kind. So Germany has some very strict free speech limits around that topic in specific. In the USA, which is where I'm based, talking about that concept is permissible within the bounds of free speech, right? You're permitted to be a jerk, right? You're permitted to be a total jerk. The limits are when you get to things like, okay, now you are inciting violence, right? Now, when you start going from, oh, I hate Koreans, right, to let's go beat up some Koreans, now you've crossed that line. And from a language perspective, it's very hard to determine that. And this goes to a whole raft of other things. There is an entire family, for example, of language models that have been released that are open source that have no censorship. They're all the uncensored llama derivatives. And I use these models because they're more creative. They have wider creative capabilities, but they 100% also will generate problematic text. You're like, and you start going, how does this model know about it? And then you realize that family was trained on data from Facebook, WhatsApp, and Instagram. And Facebook has never been a bastion of truthfulness or kindness. So it's like, okay, there's a lot in this model that could be very, very problematic. So there is no good way to say this is, we're going to prevent this type of speech because that's the way language works. And the other problem that you run into then is, to what you were alluding to, is what is the line, right? Does a politician who's obviously lying about something, do you curtail that speech, right? This is what social networks have tried and failed to do in any effective way whatsoever. The one semi-working model that we have of this is Wikipedia. Like Wikipedia in general has somehow managed to toe the line without being filled with blatantly incorrect garbage all the time. But even there, that's a battle that they have to fight. And there doesn't seem to be, there's definitely no technological solution here because values differ, right? A model that is used in, say, a country that uses Sharia, Islamic law, as the fundamental system of law, that's going to have very different outcomes. One of the new models that was just released by China has like the biggest number of weights and parameters in a publicly made model. But guess what? When you start querying the model about concepts like Maoism stuff, it responds uniformly favorably. Like, okay, so this model has this level of biases in it.
One of the most hotly debated topics in the AI community these days is one that you also covered recently, and you alluded to earlier, open source versus closed source AI. Maybe start out with your definition of what that means, and then your perspective on, does AI want to be open source, or is it better for humanity for it to be closed source?
So we'll go back to the pizza analogy. The difference between closed source and open source AI is, for example, ChatGPT and the GPT-4 model is closed source. It is essentially a pizza delivery service. You call it up, you get pizza, and it's good pizza, and you're happy with that pizza. But if you want something that OpenAI doesn't have on its menu, you can't get it, right? Maybe you want rotten anchovies on your pizza. I mean, I don't know anyone who does, but suppose you do. And they're like, nope, can't have that. I'm like, well, what if I want that? Too bad. Open source, again, going back to the analogy of the person who went out, ate a bunch of pizzas, wrote a recipe book. Open source AI models essentially give you the cookbook and say, here's the recipe book that we built. You can modify it. You can fine tune it. You can train it and stuff like that. You're not going to change the foundational model much without a lot of work, but you can fine tune the model, which is basically changing the recipes to some degree. You can say, yeah, you know what? I want this model to be able to give me rotten anchovies. Then you have to take that model and run it on your hardware. Now, many of these models you can run on a good gaming laptop, right? You don't need like a data center for it. You do if you're going to scale it to production, but just for personal use, you can run it on a laptop. And you get the output that you get from it, rotten anchovies and all. And sometimes if you requested rotten anchovies, the other ingredients it gives you are also rotten, but you have to deal with that because that's what you requested. So it's almost difference between delivery service versus, bake it home. So one of those bake at home pizza kits, like most of the pizza's already made, but you can change the toppings. You buy those at the grocery store. And that differentiation between closed and open source is based on your use cases. There are some use cases that you cannot do with the closed source models like OpenAI and ChatGPT and DALL-E, et cetera. I ran into a situation the other day with DALL-E where I gave it a prompt and it said that violates our content policy. And I'm like, there's no way this prompt violates the content policy. I wrote, show me a picture of a professional woman in an office holding a limp tape measure against a billboard of charts. The keyword that triggered that content violation was the word limp. I'm like, it's a tape measure, right? But because of the very primitive filtration system they have to intercept some of these prompts, it got intercepted. So I could not do that. So I had to resort to running stable diffusion in a instance to generate the exact same thing. That's a silly example, but there's plenty of things the closed source models will not let you do. You can ask a whole bunch of political questions. You will get no answers on them. Trying to generate political content, you will not be able to do that. That you can do with the open source systems. Now, the flip side is there is absolutely no way to regulate open source at all. By definition, once an open source model is released, you cannot put that cat back in the bag. And so there is the potential for greater misuse of those models, but that was going to happen anyway. It doesn't matter, whose model in the USA you released, because China's releasing its own models. Was it Saudi Arabia that released Falcon, the Falcon 40B model? I don't remember who released it, but it was a huge open source model from a Middle Eastern country. That's out in the wild now. So all these models are out in the wild, and there's no way for anyone to regulate their use once someone just downloads it, runs it on the computer, any more than you can regulate someone, downloading OpenOffice and, using the OpenOffice word processor to write hate speech.
You and I have both experimented with GPT for all. And it took 8 months for you and I to be able to I'm running the 7 billion parameter model locally on my laptop. And I have access to all of the hyperparameters. I can tune it, set the temperature. I see exactly how it's making its decisions. As a technologist, that's mind-blowing that it only took 8 months. But it's very much relegated to, hobbyists and technologists today to be able to have that level of control. Fast forward a couple of years, what's the consumer experience like with generative AI, given that where we're at right now, for as much as everybody's hyperventilating over what LLMs can do, I think you and I would agree we're in like the Paleolithic era. What does it look like, just to be a human, interacting with AI technology in a few years?
Who knows? I mean, I can barely tell what's going to happen in 3 weeks. But here's the way things are trending. We are currently in the era of open source models that are very good performing. At 7 and 13 billion parameters. Many of those are not commercially licensable. The next iteration, the next generation of these models will be. And then you're going to see a trend that is already happening dramatically accelerate. And that is language model prompting in every piece of software that you use. So Photoshop, for example, already has generative fill. I could take a screenshot of you right now and put you in the Swiss Alps, right? Very, very easily. Adobe Illustrator just released a generative pattern change. So you can take a vector drawing that you've done and recolor it with a prompt. Unity, the video game system, Unity AI is going to have generative capabilities within its game development environment, which is going to be a much bigger deal than people realize. Because instead of having to spend 80 hours designing a single scene for, in a 3D environment, you can say, make a office, a commercial office with wood paneling and the sunlight shining, and it will generate this scene that you can then use with cameras to generate movies, to generate video games and interactive environments. HubSpot, the CRM software, has ChatSpot, which is a GPT-4 interface into your own HubSpot instance. Microsoft is going to have the GPT-4 in their version in Microsoft Office, called Copilot, later this year. And then in Windows 11, like the operating system itself will have a language prompt in it. So this stuff is going to be in every single piece of software. Any software essentially that is even moderately complex is going to have generative AI in it, just as part of the interface, right? As a way for people to interact. So the number one thing that people need to be doing now and getting skilled up on is prompt engineering, learning how to talk to these models to get the optimum results, because you're going to be doing it everywhere. For the more technologically sophisticated, we're already seeing it. You go on a Hugging Face, for example, there are thousands of models now that you can. They're mostly llama derivatives, but there are thousands of models. That's going to be in the tens or hundreds of thousands, especially as you get more commercially licensed models. And they're going to be purpose-built for everything. You will have a model that's specifically fine-tuned just to do X or Y or Z, and the more sophisticated companies will have those. It may be restricted to a language set. It may be built with LangChain to have more interactive processes, but those capabilities are going to be open to pretty much everyone. I mean, the fact that Apple is putting transformers on iOS devices to run on device, just for autocorrect is in itself mind-blowing. That's how compact these models are getting. So they're going to be in everything, everywhere, and it's a computing paradigm that people are going to have to adapt to. The sooner you get better at prompt engineering, the more valuable an employee you're going to be. One of the things that we've been saying forever is AI isn't going to take your job. Someone skilled at AI is going to take the job of someone who is not skilled at AI.
We've talked about the ethics and the regulatory frameworks. We've talked about the technology. Something that I feel like isn't discussed enough is, as more content that you and I as consumers interact with was generated by AI, I'm concerned that there's just going to be a reversion to the mean. Already, as soon as I see a newsletter not from Christopher Penn that just has weak writing, I know it was generated by AI, and the quality I feel like of the output is diminished. Maybe it's my perception of it, but I'm concerned that the movie scripts that we see, the digital ads, the quality of the content is going to get worse, because it's an easy way for everyone who's mediocre at creating content to get better. Is it also an opportunity for everybody who's great to continue being creative and exercising, what makes them great? Or should we just agree that, the world of the future is going to look very bland with respect to creativity?
There's two different angles to this. One, we're already ahead of that. We were ahead of that route before. I mean, content farms overseas and stuff like that. Get the gig economy was already creating mediocre content or less than mediocre content. The number of pitches I get in my inbox for high quality guest post has not slowed down. And I read those, I'm like, well, why would I? Even if I could consider that before, why do I do that now? Because I can get an AI to write better than you can. To some of these pitches. But think about it. How many reboots have we had of Batman or Superman, or the Justice League and stuff like that. And are they any better, conceptually than what's come before? Not really. You see that a lot in entertainment. There's just so much recycling over and over the same concepts. It's very rare to see anything legitimately net new that you go, wow, that's totally different. So we're already at sort of this content mediocrity just because that's just the nature of trying to scale. Every company that wanted to get into SEO tried to scale, and they often did so by generating a lot of content that wasn't very good. Machines today, yes, particularly if you're not very good at prompt engineering, you will just generate boring, bland content. You can absolutely use these tools to create unique content, but it's not the tool that's going to do the generation, it's you. One of my favorite techniques is to do a show like this, or just record something in voice recording, and they send it out for transcription to Whisper or Otter or any of these tools, and then run that through a language model to clean up the and the repetitions and stuff. And it's still my voice, still my words, still my ideas. It's just now cleaned up. Where the excellent content creators who have the budget and who have the access to the skill or technique will do is you will have a fine-tuned model that is you. So for example, I can take all of my newsletters and all my blog posts, because you really only need 50 or 60 to do a good fine-tune. And I can take a llama model and say, now I'm going to reweight this model. I'm going to fine-tune to sound like me. And you will get that neural style transfer. And then it's just a question of how do you generate new content with it? But it's going to be much more like you than it is the generic model. So you will still see that level of creativity. Where things are going, that is very, very interesting. There's a project called Dream GPT that takes essentially what are called hallucinations, aka screw-ups, that these models generate. And instead of treating them as oh, we don't want that, it says, well, what if we could use this to inspire a machine version of creativity? What if the screw up is actually a way to be more creative? And it's interesting. Right now, I ran it through some tests, and it was okay. It still was not to the level of like a really good human creativity, but I'll say this: it was better than a corporate brainstorming session, which has no creativity most of the time at all. So I think there will be a sort of bifurcation. You will have the terrible content creators rise to the level of mediocre / good. And then there will be the already outstanding content creators who will use these tools to become even better. Yes, you will have a large middle ground of meh, but you already do. But I think these tools will also help the excellent creators become even more excellent if they're open-minded about it. And this is one of the things that I have a substantial problem with. It's particularly what's happening in Hollywood right now. The Writers Guild of America is on strike. SAG-AFTRA is about to go on strike when we're recording this. And one of the big negotiating points that these unions are going after, saying absolutely no use of AI. I'm like, get real, guys. Amazon Studios, Netflix, and Apple. Gee, what do these companies have in common? They're technology companies first. You're not going to tell them not to use AI. What you should be doing is saying, we humans will be the overseers of AI. We'll have final stamp of approval on anything AI generates. So we'll keep you employed, but it will also ensure that it's not generating that mediocre dreck that we're concerned about.
Hey, Christopher, we're about out of time, and thank you for letting us go way off script. This has been a fun conversation, but you're not getting off the hot seat without answering one last question for me. So most of your content, as we've been discussing, is very, very cerebral, very thoughtful, very well researched. Recently, a couple weeks back on one of your podcasts, In-Ear Insights, you and your partner, Katie, discussed the topic of, is AI making us lazy and dumb? And I thought it was an interesting dialogue. Maybe share with our audience. What was your perspective on the impact on humans, on humanity of AI?
I mean, we're already lazy and dumb. It is baked into our biology to do the least work possible. That's true of every animal, right? Every animal, to conserve energy, will always do the least amount of work needed to survive. In the context of AI and technology, we already do this to a great degree. We find somebody under 30 who is skilled at using a paper map and a compass to navigate. It's going to be a difficult thing to find. Find somebody under 30 who knows and actively goes to things like a printed encyclopedia to look up stuff rather than Googling for it. We've changed a lot of our habits based on the tools available to us. And we will continue to do so with artificial intelligence because that's our nature. The big question we have to ask is, are we giving up anything for those trade-offs, right? Should you be able to still use a map and a compass? Suppose you forgot your phone or it's not been charged something. Could you still look at a map of the town you're in and go, oh, I know how to get from point A to B. I can do that navigation. I think there is still a very good place for those skills as basic survival skills, but do you need them every day? No, I don't need to be able to fire a bow and arrow or shoot a rifle every day. Do I still polish those skills just in case I need them? Yes, from time to time, because things happen. And so I think that we have to be judicious in our use of AI, but also understand when something has run its course. This is a conversation that's being had a lot in education right now. What is the value of a term paper when a machine can write it better than the student? What is the term paper supposed to do? It is supposed to be a test of knowledge to see if you can synthesize knowledge and spit it out in some fashion. You may have things, good educators should be looking at things like Socratic debate and dialogue and stuff as replacements for the term paper, because you don't need to be able to write a term paper to prove you know this stuff. You have to be able to defend it. You have to be able to think critically about it, and those are skills that we may need to look to the past to be able to make education work in the future.
Christopher, when we meet up in person, promise that you won't bring your bow and arrow.
I generally only carry knives, depending on where I'm going. I usually carry at least a couple knives on me, but my bow and arrow is over my desk.
Good to know. Well, I enjoyed talking about everything from the future of humanity to AI governance, and it really does feel like we're just getting started. So we might have you back for another episode.
I would love to.
Good stuff. Christopher, where can the audience find out more about you and your work?
The easiest place to go to start is TrustInsights.ai. Go there. There's links to everything else from there. And if you want to read my personal stuff, you can go to ChristopherSPenn.com.
There you have it. Follow Christopher on social and go sign up for the newsletter. You'll enjoy it as much as I have been enjoying it. And gosh, that's all the time we have for this week on AI and the future of work. As always, I'm your host, Dan Turchin from People Rain. And of course, we are back next week with another fascinating guest.